kind of complements, I think, pretty well what we just heard in the first part of the session. What I want to talk about is what I call from platforms to ecosystems. In the talk before, it was called city planning, but I think kind of the mindset is actually very similar. And I'm focusing on slightly different things, but the overall topic is relatively similar. So, just very briefly about myself, why I'm here, and why I was deciding to actually give that presentation. It's not working, right? I'm just very loud. So it's working. Oh, yes. Okay, yeah, that's different. Now I have to be careful with how loud I am. Just very briefly about myself. My name is Erik Wilde. I'm a computer scientist by training. I have done API stuff mostly for about the last year. And my background is mostly sort of in a very tech-specific way when approaching things because I'm a techie by heart. The team that I work with and why I'm here and why I'm interested about everything API is called API Academy. This morning already you heard from Ronnie Mitra, who's also part of our team. We're a very small team. We just grew by one. So there used to be 4 of us, Matt, Mike, Ronnie, and myself. And now we also have Mehdi with us. So there's 5 people and we travel the world and yell about APIs and try to get people excited. And we also talk to a lot of companies that are working with APIs or looking at API strategies and are wondering, how should we do this API thing? And of course, one of the things that we hear about a lot, and I can shamelessly plug that book because I did not write that. My API Academy colleagues published that when I joined last year. So a lot of the focus nowadays when you talk to big organizations is about microservices. We just heard about that, and there's a lot of noise in that space in general. And when big organizations look at microservices, they always look at them at least partly with the idea of innovation, right? How can we become faster? We want to be faster in innovating and changing and looking at new opportunities, trying things out, failing fast, all the wonderful words that you're hearing. And one of the things that sometimes is a little bit strange when you talk to big organizations that have been doing IT at a large scale for a long time is that they look at microservices and then immediately jump to this conclusion of, oh, we should build a platform for that so that all of our developers can build their APIs in that wonderful API platform and build their microservices in there. Right? And you're wondering, it's like, what is that supposed to mean? Isn't that exactly what we're trying to get away from? So what I want to do in this talk is just highlight a little bit this kind of inherent tension between industrialization of an API ecosystem that you might have and what to look out for that you don't really take away some of the benefits that you're trying to get by going through this industrialization in maybe not the best way. And one of the things that I ran into when I came here yesterday, so I live in Zurich, so I went to the airport and just by sheer coincidence, there was a newspaper lying around with this headline on it. The article is about something totally different, but I just liked the headline that said, innovation only works bottom up, right? So really this idea that if you want to have innovation, you have to give the freedom to experiment and try out new things and do things that you weren't planning for to the teams that are supposed to be the ones doing the innovation, right? So if you build a platform for them and tell them, you innovate there now, right? That's kind of odd. And that's what microservices try to avoid by giving a lot of freedom, much more freedom than people used to have to individual developers. And I think that is where some of the tension comes from in the microservices space, that on the one hand, microservices tell you this story, everybody is free to do whatever they like, but then the architects and big organizations say, wait a minute, right? We can't really do it quite like this, otherwise we'll have chaos, right? So we have to organize things a little. And what you end up with is what I call the platform dilemma, right? So when you go through this idea of developing services and cultivating a space in which services are developed and your expectation is that they will create value and be wonderful and innovative and do all the things that you want them to be, there's always this tension that on the one hand, a platform supports certain things, right? You build a platform, you put certain things in it, and you try to support whoever is building on that platform. But a platform also constrains things, right? It makes certain assumptions and says, if you're playing in that platform space, this is how you play. And this whole idea of balancing these two things, how can you support things? How do you constrain things? Where do you gain value? Where do you lose value? I think that balance is not always approached very consciously and explicitly. And that was, I thought, a point that Ronnie was making pretty well this morning in the keynote, right? Saying that how you help people making decisions and then who is making those decisions and how you distribute this or decentralize this in your organization is pretty important, right? You can think about that in the same way as you might think about the web. And since my longest history is in web technology and web architecture, I always think about things in the context of how the web works and why it works the way it does work. So the web is a very open platform, right? But imagine if early on in the days of the web, somebody would have said, the web seems to work pretty well, and to make it work even better, and, oops, sorry, that's the curse of power saving. And to make the web work even better, henceforth, everybody will only use PHP, because PHP obviously is the greatest thing. It will make us all more productive, right? That would have been odd. And that is what happened in a lot of early web development spaces within organizations, where they said, oh, we'll do webby stuff, but we only do Java server pages or Java server faces or whatever, right? And that took a lot of freedom from the teams developing web things and their freedom to pick interesting new technologies, and henceforth made the web in those organizations much less valuable than it could have been. So understanding those two different ways how you can think of a platform, that's my main message today, right? So one way to think of a platform is sort of our good old ESB, right? The enterprise service bus, some huge, humongous thing that is sitting somewhere and doing a lot of valuable things, but it's also constraining us a lot, right? It sits somewhere, we have to manage it, it has a lot of constraints for everybody developing inside it. So it is a platform, but it's a platform in the sense that it's an actual piece of infrastructure that is sitting somewhere where you're saying, all of us here in this organization, if you want to do something, do it in there, right? Here are your constraints. So the question then is that the only way to build a platform, right? Is now that everybody says, yeah, ESB, we don't know so much, right? But are we just building the next ESB when we try to get away from the ESB? And the point I would like to make is saying that no, it doesn't have to be that, right? If you think about things in the right way, I think you can come up with a different notion of a platform, which is, I think, most widely known, reflected in the idea when people talk about the web platform, right? When you think about the web platform, it's not a concrete platform. There's not a single piece of existing infrastructure in there that you have to build on, right? All that the web builds on is certain fundamental architectural principles, a bunch of protocols that people have to adhere to, and then also a bunch of practices, how people put them together, right? And in our opening keynote from Travis, right, for example, he was outlining this vast ecosystem of security-related protocols and patterns, right? But none of these are actual infrastructure. It's just conventions where you say, if we play by those rules, we can make things secure, but we can still have people developing whatever they want to develop in the environments that they pick, right? So to me, when I joined API Academy about a year ago and started reading up on microservices and learning about it, to me, it really, coming from the web space, right, mostly I thought, oh, finally, somebody in the enterprise IT space has understood how the web works, right? Because microservices really just do what the web does, right? They give the freedom to pick your implementation platform to individual teams, and they say, but you must have an API, right? We have to be able to talk to you. So what they do is they make sure that nothing but the API is shared, right? The implementation is entirely encapsulated, and the only thing that matters is that you tell me what you're doing. I don't know, and I should not know how you're doing it. I should only know what you're doing, right? And I think that is really the most important thing to keep in mind. And that's my main message, really, that I want to get across today. And to explain that a little bit, I would like to give you just one example, and I would like to use that example to move through this process of separating why you're doing certain things, what you're doing to satisfy certain requirements that you might have, and then how you're doing that. And like I said, I think this whole platform idea is something that really can work well when you're approaching this in a disciplined way. And you always are very disciplined in separating the what from the how, right? Don't mix those up. So as a general guideline, right, you have this idea of looking at why you might have certain requirements where you say these are the kinds of things, these are the kinds of capabilities we like to have because we have certain requirements. Security may be one of those, right? We would like to be able to communicate securely. So that's, somebody says, okay, there's something we should be using, right? Because just sending open HTTP traffic is not good enough. So there is some requirement where sometimes it's the ecosystem driving that. Sometimes it may be a service driving that, right? So it may, coming back to Ronnie's picture, right? It may be a why that originates in the architects, where the architects say, we should probably think about that, right? Like logging into all these services individually, that's really hard. We should have sort of a better way how we can coordinate that. Or sometimes it might be things where individual services might say, well, we would like to surface certain things that we're doing. How are we doing this in our API so that people can actually take advantage of it? Then the next step is to think, what are we doing to actually make it happen, right? So what are the capabilities that show up in our APIs, in our platform, that actually support this requirement that we were identifying in that why step? Right? Some of these things may become services by themselves, where you say, well, we need some identity provider. That would probably be a good idea, and that might be its own service. Or they might end up in just different ways how you use APIs, how sort of a design culture develops. So for example, in a company that I was working with, which I did not like as an idea, but the company decided to do that, and then all the APIs basically were asked to follow, was that we said all of our APIs should be able to serve XML and JSON. So at some point we said, well, if you want to do that, how can we do it? There are different ways of doing that. The way how we do it is we use content negotiation. That's how we solve this problem across our services, right? So that was, again, something that was a problem that was perceived, and then it kind of trickled down into design practices that were based on certain parts of the platform. But then how you actually do that, how you translate that XML to JSON or JSON to XML, or whether you actually sort of generate XML and JSON out of your implementation objects, like that should be up as a decision to individual services, right? That's the other thing where you say, well, that's our new rule here. We want our APIs to support XML and JSON. you guys go crazy and do it. What you could also do, and that is, I think, where the city planning or ecosystem metaphor comes in handy, is to say, and because we know that's a rule that's not trivial to follow, we may put certain pieces of infrastructure into place that make that easy for you. One, for example, could be something like a gateway that does that translation, right? Where you say, well, we can put a gateway in front of an XML service and have some JSON popping out, which may not be the greatest JSON on earth, but it's JSON, right? So that's a possible solution where you could give that to teams as an option and say, if you want to have an easier life, go ahead and use that. If you want to do it yourself, that's fine with us too, right? So the one even simpler example that I just want to walk through very quickly, just to give you another flavor of how that why, what, how stuff could work, is something that is a very, very simple example. So for example, when you look at services, very rarely do services live forever, right? Pretty much every service has a sunset in its life where it's going down, right? It's going to be decommissioned because there's no need in running it anymore. So how do you signal that? Does it just go away? Do you have a list of people to email? There's various ways how you can do that, right? One important thing might be to think about that beforehand and say, what's your plan for doing that? So one possible plan, right, there's different ways how you can do that, would be to say, well, we put that in an HTTP header field. There's a proposed header field, HTTP sunset, which allows you to do that. So the API could actually start emitting this information a month before it's decommissioned, right? And that could be a rule basically that you make and say, hey, service designers in the organizations, please think about how you manage that and make sure that somehow this thing starts popping up a month before your service goes down. Because then it's easier for people to deal with it and they can build that into their infrastructure and start generating alerts and say, hey, I'm using an API which is about to go out of business. Somebody should look at that, please. Right? But then again, how you implement that, again, is not the same question of what you're doing. Right? So this is just the what. It just tells people this is the language, the vocabulary that we're using. And then how you actually do it, you could leave that totally up to the people implementing services, right? And they could do it by hand. They could configure it into their programming frameworks. They could use some libraries that support sunsets and automatically emit those messages when the environment signals that to those libraries. Or again, you could use some gateway and just insert that header and then allow service owners to configure that gateway and say, hey, this service is going out of business, please start emitting that header, right? And you just emit that message into the gateway traffic. And the important thing here to keep in mind, again, is that this difference between what you do and how individual teams are implementing that is very important. And it's important to separate those things so that both things can evolve and develop over time, and that those shared practices of how you play well in those ecosystems or in those cities, right, that those shared practices can evolve as teams are developing better infrastructure, discover new tools, build tooling themselves. And the last thing I would like to show you is my horrible visualization of how that works. If anybody has a better idea of how to show that, I'd be more than happy to get your input, please. So the idea that I have here is to say, you have a platform that sets a number of standards basically for the services that get developed. Over time, certain practices and patterns emerge. Let's say people are saying, we should do the sunset stuff. Seems to be useful, helps people, right? Then, over time, those services doing that might actually start developing tooling and libraries that help them doing that more effectively because they discover, oh, we're all doing that. Maybe we should somehow build tooling around that, right? And then at some point, the platform might actually evolve and somebody sort of in the architecture team might say, oh, that's a useful pattern that those people over there has developed. We should probably encourage all of our services to do that, right? And then they might actually sort of bless those services and say, from now on, it would be good if all services were emitting sunset information. And here are some tooling libraries that we actually use in-house that you might want to use to make that as easy as possible for you. Okay, that was all. So, sorry, going back here. So what I wanted to tell you about was really that for sustainable service systems that can evolve, platforms that are scalable over time, right? I think it's important to really go through this process of starting from the why, looking at the what, being very clear that the what does not determine the how, right? And then come up with some answers to what people have to do and how they might be doing that, and then help teams by developing solutions that teams might or might not use, and give that to them as an infrastructure that helps them to live more productively and develop more productively on that platform. Okay, that is all that I wanted to talk about. If you want to look at the slides, they're online there. You can also, my latest tweet, I was tweeting a link to my slides. So if you look at my Twitter, it's Dret, D-R-E-T. You will find a link to the slides as well. The slides are online, so you can look at them in your browser, follow all the links, and hopefully find some interesting information out there. Thank you very much.